Welcome to this news episode of the Italian Law Made Easy. Today we will try to see together, in a colloquial and simple language, what needs to be done after the opening of the succession to ensure that the heirs take possession of the hereditary assets. Obviously, the single procedure to be followed are many and vary according to the circumstances and the type of assets that fell in succession. To keep the speech easy and of interest to everyone, here we will limit our investigation to only the main and most frequent requirements. And now, let's launch our clip together.
It is now necessary to examine what needs to be done after the opening of the succession, so that heirs and legatees can take possession of the inheritance assets. The procedure differs, depending on whether it is an intestate or a testamentary succession.
In intestate succession, the heirs or their delegates, immediately after the opening of the succession, that is to say immediately after the death of the decuyus, must inform all the banks with which the latter had relations, as well as all the companies, either the partnerships and the corporations, of which he or she was a partner or shareholder, of the death of the decuyus.
It is, normally, also necessary to deliver to banks and companies a copy of the death certificate of the person whose succession is concerned. The heirs must also return to the banks any checks, credit and debit cards, and any remote banking tools issued to the deceased person.
With respect to the banks and financial companies that manage the savings that fell in succession, it is also necessary to ask them to issue the heirs with the so-called attestation of the outstanding amounts, that is to say, a document in which these institutions declare and certify the credits, namely the sums deposited in current accounts or other money deposit instruments, and debts, such as mortgages, bank overdrafts or other liabilities of the deceased towards the bank, in addition to the value of the other savings instruments, which the deceased had adhered to at the time of opening the succession. This document will then be indispensable for submitting the declaration of estate.
Within 12 months from the opening of the succession, it will then be necessary to submit the declaration of estate to the competent offices of the Agenzia delle Entrate, the Italian Inland Revenue Service.
This declaration is aimed at a multiplicity of purposes. Among the main effects of the presentation of the declaration of estate, it should be remembered that this allows the revenue agency itself to calculate the inheritance tax, where due. It also determines the updating of the cadastral records of the properties fallen in succession, with the data of the heirs, and allows banks and financial companies to transfer to the heirs the sums of the decuyus, deposited in current accounts, saving books and other savings instruments.
A copy of this declaration must be provided to the banks, in order to obtain the release of the sums deposited in current accounts and other savings instruments, and to the companies of which the decuyus was a shareholder, for the relative fulfillments.
In testamentary succession, thus differing from intestate succession, the first thing to do is to proceed with the opening of the will, and to its publication by a notary. On this basis, it will be possible to identify who the heirs and legatees are, and which inherited assets belong to each one of them.
Once this deed has been completed, the heirs and legatees will have to carry out the same formalities provided for the intestate succession.
In either case, however, the heirs will become joint owners of the decuyus's assets, in proportion of their respective inheritance shares. This except in the case where, in the will, the testator has expressly divided all the assets that make up the estate among the different heirs. Therefore, as long as this communion is not dissolved, the various heirs will have to jointly manage the inheritance.
Carrying out of all the formalities required to the heirs to take possession of the hereditary assets can be very complex and articulated for those who have no experience in the sector. For these reasons, heirs often prefer to delegate the fulfillment of these formalities to professionals with experience in the field, such as notaries, lawyers, or accountants. Furthermore, there are some aspects that are often unclear and problematic for the heirs. It is necessary here to clarify at least 2 points of particular importance about the issues we have dealt with. In the first place, speaking of the cases in which the accused was a member of one or more companies, it should be clarified that there are some very important distinctions to be made in this regard. It is in fact good to keep in mind that the procedures envisaged for the succession to the partner in a partnership, such as for example S&C and SAS, are quite different from those stated in respect of the succession to a shareholder in a corporation, such as for example SRL or SPA. In order not to complicate the matter unnecessarily, we will not enter here into all the specific differentiation envisaged in this regard by the Italian legislation. However, it is good to keep in mind at least one macroscopic difference between the two categories of companies with respect to the succession of such a stakeholder. namely, that in corporation the heir acquires ownership of the shares and thus takes over the position of the accused as a shareholder. In partnership, on the other hand, the normal procedure is that, following the death of a partner, the other partners liquidate the value of his or her stake in the company to the heirs or dissolve the company itself. The hypothesis of the entry of the heir as a partner in the company in the place of the accused remain an exceptional case. Furthermore, from a purely practical and operational point of view, in the event of a testamentary succession, it is good to specify that, for the purposes of the publication of the will, in the cases of public or secret will, it will be sufficient to inform the notary of the death of the testator, and the notary him or herself will carry out all the formalities necessary for the publication of the will. On the other hand, in the case of an holographic will, the heirs will have to make contact with the notary to carry out the related formalities, and will also need to deliver the original of the will to the notary him or herself.
If you appreciated this free video course, please like it on YouTube. And if you want to be informed on new videos and other free initiatives by ARMLegal, directed to give information on what the Italian law says, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, or follow our Facebook or LinkedIn page, or our Twitter account.
Also, this episode is over. We thank you again for following us. In the next episode, we will examine the question of the division of the estate between the heirs. Thanks again, and see you next Monday.